The Mafia boss panicked without an interpreter. Even the black maid showed up. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The tension in the air was palpable. Inside a lavish, marble-walled office, the Mafia boss, Antonio Russo, sat at the head of a long table. His sharp eyes scanned the room as he prepared for an important meeting with several international investors. The stakes were high, the pressure immense. As he looked over the documents laid out before him, his mind was elsewhere. He had just learned that his trusted interpreter, who was supposed to assist during the meeting, had been delayed due to an emergency. His anxiety began to rise. Without the translator, Antonio would be unable to understand the investors, and worst of all, he feared they would sense his vulnerability. The room was filled with a quiet tension as the investors, seated at the other end of the table, waited for Antonio to begin the discussion. His hand hovered over the documents, but he could not focus. His Italian accent would be hard to mask, and without an interpreter, his position was precarious. Antonio was used to being in control, used to being the one who gave orders, not the one in need. The silence stretched on, his thoughts spinning. As he looked up, he felt his face flush. The investors were beginning to whisper among themselves. He could hear the words unprofessional, unprepared, and unfit floating in the air. It was an unbearable feeling for Antonio, a man who had worked tirelessly to build his empire. The last thing he needed was to appear weak in front of these powerful figures. The panic started to creep in, but he had to keep up the facade. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. At that very moment, the door to the room opened. Antonio's eyes darted to the entrance. Standing in the doorway was someone he never expected to see. Maria, the black maid who worked in his mansion. Her presence was an unexpected shock, but there she was, standing tall, her calm demeanor at odds with the chaos in the room. She had no business being there, yet her eyes met his, and she simply stepped forward. Maria had overheard the growing tension as she passed by the office, her footsteps light on the marble floor. She had been working at the mansion for several months, doing everything from cleaning to assisting with small tasks. But today, something had shifted. She couldn't ignore the way Antonio's frustration had grown, how his usual confidence had evaporated. It was clear to her that the man who ruled the streets of New York was suddenly facing something he couldn't control. Without thinking, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She knew a little French and had a basic understanding of Spanish, enough to catch the crucial details that the investors were discussing. Antonio had never paid her much attention before, but now, it seemed that she was the only one who could help him. As the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, Maria took a step forward, cleared her throat, and spoke. "Sir, I may be able to assist," she said softly, her voice carrying an unexpected authority. The investors looked at each other in confusion, unsure of what to make of the woman who was clearly out of place in this boardroom. Antonio, still in a state of panic, hesitated. He had never been in a situation like this before, where a maid, someone from the lowest rung of his household, could offer any kind of help. But as he looked at her, something inside him shifted. He nodded slowly, signaling her to proceed. Maria's voice was steady and clear as she translated the key points of the conversation. She picked up on the nuances that Antonio had missed, the words hidden beneath the surface of the discussions. As the minutes passed, Antonio found himself becoming more and more captivated by her unexpected skill. This woman, who had worked for him silently, without fanfare, was now doing something no one else could. She was saving his business deal. The tension in the room lifted as Maria effortlessly bridged the gap between Antonio and the investors. The Mafia boss, for the first time that day, felt a sense of relief wash over him. His empire was intact, and it was thanks to the black maid who had stepped up when no one else could. Antonio leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Maria's calm face. He had underestimated her, and now he realized that she had far more to offer than anyone could have imagined. His mind was racing with the possibilities, but for now, he knew one thing. Maria had changed everything. and his respect for her was beyond words. As Maria continued to translate the discussion in the room, Antonio Russo's thoughts raced. He was still trying to come to terms with the fact that the woman who had quietly cleaned his mansion for months had just saved one of his most important business deals. As the investors nodded, clearly impressed with Maria's impeccable translation skills, Antonio found himself admiring her calm composure in the face of such a high-pressure situation. For a moment, he forgot about the growing tension that had plagued him just moments ago. This was not just any maid. She had the sharp instincts of a professional. As the conversation shifted to new topics, Antonio leaned back in his chair, his mind working furiously. What had he been thinking all these months? How many times had he ignored Maria, taking her presence for granted, not once considering her potential? Now, here she was, standing in front of him, her presence transforming the situation. When the meeting finally came to a close, the investors seemed satisfied with the way things had gone. They gathered their papers, exchanging pleasantries with Antonio before heading for the door. Antonio nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere, still fixated on the unexpected turn of events. As the last investor left the room, Antonio stood up and walked towards Maria. She was packing her things, ready to leave as usual, but Antonio stopped her before she could turn to go. "Maria," he said, his voice soft but commanding. She paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone still respectful. Antonio studied her for a moment, trying to find the right words. "You saved this meeting today," he began, his voice tinged with genuine gratitude. "I never imagined that you could help in a situation like this." Maria hesitated, not sure if she had heard him correctly. The Mafia boss, the man who commanded respect and fear in the city, was thanking her, a maid, for her assistance. She had always kept to herself, doing her work without expecting anything in return. But now, in this moment, it felt like everything had changed. "I did what I could," she said quietly, a modest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Antonio felt a surge of respect for her, something he hadn't expected. He had spent his life surrounded by people who sought power, wealth, and influence. But here was someone who had shown him a different kind of strength, quiet, understated, and yet undeniably powerful. "You did more than you know," Antonio replied. "I've been surrounded by people who only care about their own agendas. I never realized the value of someone like you, who simply does what needs to be done, without any expectation of recognition." Maria looked down, feeling a wave of humility wash over her. She wasn't used to praise, especially not from someone like Antonio Russo. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, her voice sincere. Antonio's expression softened as he took a step closer to her. "I need someone like you on my side," he said, his voice low and serious. Maria looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Antonio paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You've shown me something today, Maria. You've shown me that true strength doesn't always come from those with power and wealth. Sometimes, it comes from the quiet ones who know how to act in the moment, without hesitation." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected this kind of attention from Antonio, let alone respect. She had spent years working for people like him, but no one had ever acknowledged her in such a way. Antonio's voice grew firmer. "I want you to stay. I want you to work closely with me. You'll have more responsibility, more influence than you can imagine." Maria stood frozen, not knowing how to respond. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself. She had come to New York to escape a difficult past, not to get involved in the dangerous world of the Mafia. I don't know what to say," she finally managed to say. Antonio smiled, sensing her hesitation. "I know this is unexpected," he said, "but I'm offering you something no one else can. I want you to help me lead. You've already proven that you can handle the pressure, and I need someone with your ability. Will you consider it?" Maria's heart raced as she processed his words. She had never considered herself a leader, nor did she want to be part of Antonio's world of crime and violence. But something about his offer stirred something inside her, a part of her that had been dormant for so long. She had always been told what to do, always been invisible in the eyes of those around her. Now, Antonio Russo was offering her a chance to take control, to use her skills in ways she had never imagined. I need some time to think," she said, her voice shaky. Antonio nodded, understanding her hesitation. Take all the time you need, he said, his tone gentler now. But know this, whatever you decide, you have my respect. And that's not something I give easily. As Maria left the room, she felt a sense of uncertainty, but also something else, a sense of possibility. She had never imagined her life would take such a turn, but now she couldn't help but wonder what might come next. Days passed, and Maria found herself walking a fine line between two worlds. Since her unexpected intervention during the meeting, everything had shifted. Antonio had offered her more than just a chance to work alongside him. He had presented her with an opportunity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. As she cleaned the mansion, her mind raced with the possibilities. She had never asked for more responsibility, never dreamed of being anything more than the maid she had always been. But now, every time she looked at Antonio, she saw something different in his eyes, a mix of respect and something else she couldn't quite place. Her days were no longer spent in silence, quietly doing her job. Now, she was constantly aware of her every move, her every action. Antonio had asked her to meet him again, and this time, it wasn't just to discuss business. It was a private conversation, one that could change everything. Maria felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Should she accept his offer and step into a world that she had always been taught to stay away from? Or should she continue her quiet life, forever remaining invisible in the background? As she made her way to the office, she noticed the guards standing at the door, their eyes following her every step. The mansion was always buzzing with activity, but today, it felt different, more tense. She knocked lightly on the door before entering, her heart pounding in her chest. Antonio was sitting behind his massive desk, looking over some documents. He didn't look up immediately, but Maria could feel his attention shift to her the moment she stepped inside. "Maria," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of something deeper. "Come in." She hesitated for a moment before crossing the room to stand in front of him. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something warm there, a genuine sense of connection. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Antonio continued, his tone more serious now. "You have a rare gift, Maria. You're calm under pressure, and you see things others don't. That's why I want you by my side." Maria felt her stomach twist. This wasn't a simple job offer. This was an invitation into a world she knew little about. A world filled with danger, power, and decisions that could change lives. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm just a maid. I've never been part of this world." Antonio leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "That's exactly why I need you. You're not like everyone else in this house. You don't care about the power or the money. You just do your job, and you do it well. That's the kind of person I need. Someone who isn't afraid to speak up when it matters." Maria's heart raced as she absorbed his words. She had always kept her distance from the dangerous side of the world Antonio inhabited. She had heard the stories, the power struggles, the betrayals, the violence. But she had never imagined herself as a part of it. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio smiled, but it was a different kind of smile than she had seen before, soft, almost like he trusted her. "I want you to be my eyes and ears. I need someone I can trust, someone who won't be swayed by the chaos that surrounds me. You're already in the right place. You see things that no one else does." Maria swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She had never considered herself special, never thought she could have any influence over people like Antonio Russo. But now, the possibilities seemed too great to ignore. "And if I say no?" she asked, still unsure of what to think. Antonio's expression grew serious again. "If you say no, nothing changes. You go back to doing what you've always done. But if you say yes, I promise you that you will never be overlooked again. You'll have power. You'll have respect." Maria stood there for a long moment, her mind racing. The offer was tempting, but it came with a price. She didn't know what kind of world she would be stepping into, but she also knew that turning it down meant staying in the shadows forever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I'll do it," she said softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt inside. Antonio's eyes gleamed with approval. "Good," he said. "We'll start immediately. There's much to do." As Maria turned to leave the office, her mind was still spinning. She had made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. There was no going back now. She had chosen to step into the unknown, to embrace a role she never imagined for herself. But as she walked down the hallway, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of excitement building inside her. For the first time, she wasn't just a maid. She was something more. And whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on. Maria's life took a turn she never anticipated. After agreeing to work closely with Antonio Russo, she quickly realized how far-reaching his world of power and danger was. In the following days, her responsibilities grew, but so did her sense of unease. She was constantly moving between two worlds, one of luxury and wealth, where Antonio's empire reigned, and another of silence, where she quietly observed the lives of those around her. Her role was clear, but the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. Antonio had placed her in a position of influence, but that influence came with its own risks. Maria had spent most of her life avoiding attention, but now, it seemed as if everyone was watching her every move. It wasn't just Antonio who was keeping an eye on her. His trusted associates, the men who worked in the shadows to ensure his empire ran smoothly, were now observing her as well. She noticed their eyes following her, their conversations halting as she passed. They weren't unfriendly, but they weren't warm either. The tension in the mansion was palpable. It felt as though every action she took, every word she spoke, was being weighed and scrutinized. Despite this, Maria pushed forward. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. She had come from a life of hard work, where every day was a battle to survive. Now, she was being offered something more: power, respect, and the chance to be seen. She couldn't afford to squander that opportunity. One afternoon, Antonio called her into his office. She knew it was time for their first real discussion about the work ahead. As she entered the room, Antonio was standing by the window, looking out over the city. The sunlight cast a warm glow on his face, but his expression was serious, focused. "Maria, come in," he said, his voice calm but firm. She stepped forward, her heart racing. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where she would truly begin her new role. Antonio motioned for her to sit. "We have a lot to discuss," he said, his voice low. "I've been watching you closely. You're handling things well so far." Maria nodded, not knowing what to say. She hadn't expected praise, but she didn't know if she was ready to take on more responsibility. "There's a shift happening, Maria," Antonio continued. "Things are changing, and I need someone I can trust by my side." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had heard rumors of shifts in power within the organization, but she had never imagined that she would be involved. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Antonio turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "I'm moving forward with a new initiative," he said. "But there are people who want to see me fail, people who want to take what I've built. I need someone to help me navigate these waters. And I think you're the one." Maria's mind raced. She had never imagined herself in this position. She had always been on the outside, looking in. But now, Antonio was offering her a chance to be a part of something much bigger than she had ever dreamed. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. Antonio smiled, though it was a small, calculating smile. "I need you to gather information," he said. "Listen carefully to the conversations around you. Watch what people do, not just what they say. And report back to me. You'll be my eyes and ears." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. This was what she had signed up for, a life of constant observation, of living in the shadows. But it also meant power, influence, and respect. It meant being part of something larger than herself. "I can do that," she said, her voice firm. Antonio's gaze softened, but there was still a sharpness in his eyes that Maria couldn't ignore. "I know you can," he said. "But there's more. I need you to be prepared. There will be challenges ahead. People will try to test you. They'll try to use you. But I believe you're stronger than they think." Maria nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had no illusions about what she was getting into. She knew that Antonio's world was filled with dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. But she was ready. She had to be. Antonio stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And one more thing," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I trust you, Maria. Don't let me down." The intensity in his words left her breathless. She had never felt this much pressure before, but at the same time, she felt something else, a sense of purpose. For the first time in her life, she was seen. She was important, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As she left the office, Her mind was racing. She had been given a task, a responsibility, and a chance to prove herself. But she also knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. She had entered a world where nothing was guaranteed, where loyalty was constantly tested, and where betrayal was always just around the corner. But Maria wasn't afraid. She had lived through far worse. Now, she was part of something bigger, and she wasn't going to back down. The days that followed were a blur of activity. An observation for Maria. She had settled into her new role, and though it had only been a short time since she agreed to work more closely with Antonio, she already felt the weight of her decisions. Her days were filled with quiet moments in the background, watching the comings and goings of Antonio's associates, listening to whispers, and noting every little detail. She learned quickly that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. People in this world hid their true intentions behind well-crafted facades. It was a game of power, manipulation, and trust, things Maria had never been part of before. But now, she was involved, and there was no turning back. Antonio trusted her, and that was both a burden and a privilege. Her role had changed from that of an invisible servant to someone who was expected to provide valuable insight. And though she tried to remain cautious, Maria couldn't help but feel a strange sense of empowerment. She had been given access to information that others only dreamed of. It wasn't just about serving anymore. It was about understanding, noticing the small things that others missed. Antonio's empire was vast, and though she had only glimpsed the surface, it was enough to know that it was built on more than just wealth. It was built on loyalty, fear, and secrets. Maria had already started to piece together the complex web of relationships and alliances that Antonio was involved in. She saw the way his associates respected him, feared him even, but she also saw the cracks in that respect. There were those who wanted to rise higher, who would betray him if it meant getting ahead. And Maria, with her keen sense of observation, was beginning to see who those people were. She was becoming more than just a bystander in the game. She was becoming a player. One evening, Antonio summoned her to his office again. It was a rare moment when he asked for her presence in such a private setting. Maria had become used to working quietly in the background, but now, as she walked down the long hallway towards his office, her heart began to race. This meeting was different. She could feel it in her bones. As she entered the room, Antonio was standing by the window, staring out at the city lights. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression unreadable. "Maria, come in," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking about how you've handled yourself." Maria didn't know how to respond. She had only been doing what was asked of her, but she knew Antonio's words carried weight. His approval meant everything in this world, and she could feel the tension in the air as she took a seat across from him. Antonio leaned against his desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've noticed something, Maria. You've been observing, not just listening, but watching the people around you. That's exactly what I need. But there's more. There's something happening that I need you to be a part of." Maria's mind raced. What could he want her to do? She had been gathering information, but now it felt like the stakes were being raised. Antonio continued, his voice steady. "There are rumors, whispers in the shadows. People are starting to question my leadership. There are factions within the organization that are growing bolder, testing my control. I need to know who is loyal and who isn't. I need you to help me find out who's behind these rumors." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. This was a task far more dangerous than what she had been doing before. This was about power, about betrayal. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio's eyes flickered with something dark. "I need you to get close to the people who are spreading these rumors. Find out what they know, who they're talking to. But be careful, Maria. This isn't just about gathering information anymore. This is about protecting what I've built. And if anyone threatens that, we deal with them." The weight of his words hit Maria like a punch to the stomach. She had never imagined that she would be asked to play such a dangerous role. She was not a killer, not someone who thrived in this world of violence and secrecy. But the reality of the situation was clear. If she wanted to be a part of this world, she had to understand the rules. And the rules were simple: loyalty above all else. And those who threatened the empire would be eliminated. "I understand," Maria said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Antonio nodded, his gaze softening for a moment. "Good. I knew I could count on you." He stood up and walked towards her, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried so much weight. We're in this together now, Maria. You're more than just a maid. You're part of something much bigger. Maria nodded, but inside, she wasn't sure what she had just agreed to. She had stepped into a world where loyalty was tested at every turn, where betrayal was a constant threat. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. She had chosen this path, and now, she would have to live with the consequences. As she left his office, Maria's mind was racing. She had a new role to play, one that would require her to be sharp, careful, and ruthless. The stakes had been raised, and she knew that her next moves would determine not just her fate, but the fate of the empire Antonio had built. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The days following Antonio's request weighed heavily on Maria. She had always been an observer, someone who kept to the background, but now, she was being thrust into the heart of a dangerous game. Antonio had given her a task, one that would test her loyalty, her resolve, and her ability to navigate the murky world of power and secrets. Maria knew she had no choice but to accept. Her role had changed forever. Every action, every word, would now have consequences. She had been asked to uncover the source of the rumors, to get close to those who were trying to undermine Antonio's empire. It was a task she hadn't been prepared for, but it was one she couldn't refuse. As she carried out her daily duties, Maria kept her eyes open. The mansion was filled with people who were part of Antonio's world, each one with their own agenda. Some were loyal, others were not. Some were eager to rise in the ranks, willing to betray anyone to get ahead. Maria had learned quickly that trust was a rare commodity in this world. The first few days were uneventful. Maria kept to her routine, but her mind was constantly on alert. She observed, listened, and gathered as much information as she could. She knew that any slip-up could cost her everything, so she was careful. But it didn't take long for the tension to escalate. One evening, as Maria was cleaning the main dining room, she overheard something that made her blood run cold. Two of Antonio's most trusted associates were speaking in hushed voices in the corner of the room. Maria couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to make her heart race. They were discussing Antonio, and not in a way that suggested loyalty. She stepped back into the shadows, making sure they didn't see her, her pulse pounding in her ears. The words she overheard were enough to make her stomach churn. She had known that there were whispers of discontent, but she hadn't expected to hear it so openly. The two men were discussing how Antonio's leadership was becoming weak, how there were cracks in his control. One of them mentioned something about a power shift, a new leader rising in the shadows. Maria's mind raced. This was what Antonio had feared. There were those who wanted to take his place. There were those who were plotting against him, using whispers and rumors to tear him down. She had to act fast. The next day, Maria carefully approached Antonio. She had learned not to waste time with pleasantries. When he called for her, she entered his office, the door closing softly behind her. Antonio was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable as he looked over some papers. "Maria," he said, glancing up. "What is it?" Maria's heart pounded as she stood before him. This was the moment she had been dreading. But she knew she had to speak up. "I overheard something," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Antonio looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What did you hear?" he asked, his tone cautious. Maria took a deep breath before continuing. "There are rumors, sir. Whispers about your leadership. Two of your associates were discussing how there's a shift in power, how some of them think you're becoming weak. They're planning something, sir. I don't know all the details, but I heard enough to know that they're not loyal." Antonio's face remained impassive, but Maria could see the tension in his jaw. He sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk rhythmically. "Who were they?" he asked, his voice low. Maria hesitated for a moment before answering. "I couldn't hear everything, but I'm certain it was Marco and Gabriel." Antonio's eyes flickered with recognition, and for a moment, his expression hardened. Marco and Gabriel were two of his most trusted men, but they were also the most ambitious. Maria knew that their loyalty had always been in question, but this was different. This was something more serious. Antonio didn't say anything for a long time. He simply stared at the papers in front of him, his fingers still tapping the desk. Maria stood there, waiting for him to speak, but the silence stretched on, thick with tension. Finally, Antonio looked up at her. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice calm. I'll deal with this. You did well, Maria. But don't let your guard down. There's more to this than you think. Maria nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. Antonio had heard her, and he trusted her enough to act. But at the same time, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had just handed him information that could change everything. She had put herself in even more danger by revealing the truth. As she left his office, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. The whispers were just the beginning. Antonio had built his empire through power and control, but now, it seemed that those closest to him were starting to question whether he was still the right man to lead. Maria knew that her role had just become even more critical. The rumors were out there, and she had to find out who was behind them before it was too late. The game was changing, and she had to be ready to play. But as she walked down the hallway, she couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at her. This was the moment that would define her loyalty. She had crossed the line into a world of treachery and betrayal, and there was no turning back now. The following days were tense for Maria. She had spoken to Antonio, had given him the information he needed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The mansion, once a place of routine and predictability, had become a labyrinth of secrets and lies. She was no longer just a maid, silently observing from the sidelines. Now, she was a part of the dangerous game unfolding within the walls of Antonio's empire. Maria kept her distance from the other staff, watching them with a new sense of awareness. The subtle glances exchanged between some of the men in the halls, the quiet whispers in the corners of rooms. She began to see everything in a new light. The walls were closing in. People were beginning to take sides, and Maria was becoming more and more involved in a power struggle she had never imagined. One evening, Antonio summoned her again. This time, she could sense the urgency in his tone. Her heart raced as she walked toward his office, every step echoing through the empty halls. She had become accustomed to these meetings, but this one felt different. As she entered his office, Antonio was standing by the window, the city lights casting a cold glow on his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes, held something dark, something she hadn't seen before. "Maria," he said without turning around, his voice low and measured. "Come in." She closed the door behind her, standing in the middle of the room, waiting for him to speak. The silence stretched between them. "We have a problem," Antonio continued, his back still to her. "Marco and Gabriel, they're not just talking. They're planning, and I can't let them get away with it." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected it for days, but hearing Antonio confirm it made the situation all the more real. Marco and Gabriel, two of Antonio's most trusted associates, were no longer loyal. They were plotting against him, and Maria was now caught in the middle of it all. Antonio turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I need you to get close to them. I need you to find out what they're planning, and I need it fast. Do you understand?" Maria nodded, her mind racing. She hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly, but now, it was clear that the fate of Antonio's empire, and her own place in it, depended on her ability to uncover the truth. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady. Antonio studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I don't trust anyone else to do this," he said, his voice softening for just a moment. "You've shown me that you're capable of more than anyone could have imagined. Now, I need you to prove it." Maria's pulse quickened. The weight of his words settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had always been a servant, a shadow in the background, but now, she was being asked to become something more, a spy, a key player in a dangerous game. "I won't let you down," she said, her voice firm. Antonio nodded, a slight glimmer of approval in his eyes. "I know you won't." He stepped toward her, his presence filling the room. "This is your chance, Maria. Your chance to be more than just a maid. You have the power to change everything." Maria felt the weight of his gaze. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "I'll do what it takes," she whispered, the words heavy with both determination and fear. Antonio gave her a small smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good," he said. "I'm counting on you." As she left the office, Maria's mind was a whirlwind. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The game had changed. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was a participant. Her role had evolved from that of a silent servant to one of the most important players in Antonio's world. But as she walked down the dimly lit hallway, Maria couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. Marco and Gabriel were dangerous. They had their own ambitions, and Maria was just a pawn in their plans. She had to be careful. She had to stay one step ahead. If she wasn't, she knew that the consequences could be deadly. The next few days passed in a blur. Maria kept her distance from Marco and Gabriel, watching them closely, waiting for an opportunity to learn more. She noticed that their behavior had changed, subtle shifts in their attitudes, the way they looked at Antonio with increasing contempt. They were no longer pretending to be loyal. It was becoming clear that they were preparing for something big, something that could shake Antonio's control over the empire. One night, as Maria was cleaning the dining room, she overheard a conversation between Marco and Gabriel. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Maria could make out enough to know that they were planning something in secret. They spoke of allies, of money moving in hidden channels, of a power shift that would place one of them at the top. Maria's heart raced as she listened, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. She had to act quickly. As the conversation ended, Maria slipped out of the room, her mind reeling. She had what she needed. She knew what Marco and Gabriel were planning, and now, she had to figure out how to use that information to her advantage. She wasn't just Antonio's eyes and ears anymore. She was becoming something more, a force in her own right, a woman with the power to shape the future of the empire. But with that power came danger, and Maria knew that she was now playing a game where the stakes were higher than ever. Maria felt the weight of the new responsibility settling on her shoulders with each passing day. She had gathered the information she needed, and now, Antonio was counting on her to deliver it. The tension between Marco, Gabriel, and the rest of the organization was growing, and Maria found herself at the center of it all. The whispers she had overheard had confirmed what Antonio had feared. The shift in power was not just a rumor. It was real. Marco and Gabriel were plotting to take control, and they were gathering support from some of the most influential people in the empire. Maria knew that she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to let the situation escalate further. But the deeper she got into this web of lies and deceit, the more dangerous it became. Every move she made felt like it was under a microscope, every decision scrutinized by those who had no idea of her true intentions. She had always been an outsider, a maid in the background, but now she was part of something much larger. It was a game of loyalty, and Maria was playing for the highest stakes. As the days went on, Maria continued to gather information, carefully watching Marco and Gabriel's every move. She was patient, knowing that rushing into action would be a mistake. But the tension was becoming unbearable. One night, as Maria was cleaning the hallway outside Antonio's office, she overheard something that made her stop in her tracks. It was Gabriel, speaking in hushed tones with someone Maria didn't recognize. "We move tomorrow." Gabriel's voice was low but filled with certainty. "Antonio won't see it coming. He's too busy with his little power games." Maria's heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing. They were making their move. It was happening now. She couldn't waste another second. Without thinking, Maria slipped into the shadows, her mind racing. She needed to warn Antonio, but she had to be careful. If Gabriel knew she had overheard the conversation, everything would be over. Maria quickly made her way down the hallway to Antonio's office, her pulse racing. She knocked softly, not wanting to alert anyone to her presence. Antonio called out for her to enter, and she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. He was sitting behind his desk, as usual, but there was something different about him today. His expression was cold, focused, like he was waiting for something. "Maria," Antonio said, his voice sharp. "What is it?" Maria hesitated for a moment, the weight of the information heavy on her chest. She had to tell him, but she had to be careful not to reveal how much she knew. "It's about Gabriel and Marco," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Antonio's eyes narrowed. "What about them?" he asked, his tone suddenly serious. Maria took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I overheard Gabriel talking. They're planning something big. He said they're moving tomorrow." Antonio's face remained unreadable, but Maria could see the tension in his jaw. He was processing the information quickly, calculating his next move. "Do you know what they're planning?" he asked, his voice low. Maria shook her head. "I don't know the details. But Gabriel was talking about how Antonio wouldn't see it coming. They're making their move tomorrow." Antonio stood up, his expression hardening. He was no longer the calm, collected leader she had seen before. There was something in his eyes now, an intensity that Maria hadn't expected. "We can't wait any longer," he said, his voice colder than before. "I need you to stay close. Watch Marco. Watch Gabriel. Don't let them out of your sight." Maria nodded, her stomach turning. She had known the stakes were high, but now she realized just how much danger she was in. This wasn't just about gathering information anymore. This was about survival. "What do you want me to do?" Maria asked, her voice firm. Antonio's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "Don't trust anyone. But me. If they make a move, we have to be ready to act." Maria nodded again, feeling the weight of his words. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. As she left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was shifting beneath her feet. Everything was changing, and she was at the center of it. The empire that Antonio had built was on the brink of collapse, and Maria was the only one who could hold it together. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a key player in a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The days ahead would be filled with uncertainty, but one thing was clear: Maria's loyalty would be tested like never before. The hours that followed were filled with tension, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface of the mansion. Maria had done everything she could to stay out of sight, but she knew that tonight, everything would change. Gabriel and Marco were making their move, and the clock was ticking. As she walked through the mansion, she felt the weight of the decision she had made, the choice to play this dangerous game alongside Antonio. The halls, usually filled with the sounds of staff and the soft murmur of conversation, were eerily silent. She kept her steps light, her eyes constantly scanning for any signs of trouble. Antonio had trusted her with so much, and she couldn't let him down. Her thoughts raced as she passed the grand dining room. She had to stay focused, to gather every shred of information, and to protect the empire that Antonio had built. It wasn't just about loyalty anymore, it was about survival. Marco and Gabriel were scheming, but Maria had to stay ahead of them. The mansion was filled with whispers, loyalty, betrayal, power, and fear, and Maria was in the middle of it all. She had become someone who was no longer just invisible in the background. She had become a player, someone who had the power to change everything. The decision she had made wasn't just about helping Antonio. It was about making her own path in a world she never thought she'd belong to. As she reached the end of the hall, she spotted Antonio's head of security, Luca, standing near the entrance to the courtyard. His usual stone-cold expression softened when he saw her approach. "Maria," he said, his voice low. "Antonio needs you." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this, but the urgency in Luca's voice told her that the time had come. She followed him quickly, her pace quickening as she entered the courtyard. The cold night air hit her face as they moved toward the back of the mansion. Antonio stood there, his back to her, his silhouette outlined by the dim light from the courtyard lanterns. When he turned, his face was hard, his eyes sharp with purpose. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but tense. "It's time." Maria nodded, her pulse racing. She could feel the weight of the moment, the decision that would determine the fate of everything. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Antonio's gaze never wavered. "I need you to get to Marco. Find out what he's planning. Get as close to him as you can. We don't have much time." Maria felt a surge of determination. This was it, the final step. "I'll do it," she said firmly. Antonio nodded, his expression softening for a moment. "I know you will. Just remember, Maria, trust no one but yourself." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Maria standing in the courtyard, the cold wind biting at her skin. She had no time to lose. She had to act quickly, and she had to be careful. Marco was unpredictable, and Gabriel was no better. As she moved through the shadows, Maria's mind raced with the possibilities. She had to find out everything she could about their plans, but she couldn't let them know that she was onto them. If they suspected her, everything would fall apart. Her steps were silent as she approached the area where Marco usually spent his time, his office. She had seen him enter earlier in the day, and now was the perfect moment to slip inside. The door was slightly ajar, and Maria crept in, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, but she knew where to find what she needed. Marco had a habit of leaving papers scattered on his desk, confidential documents that she had seen before. She moved quietly, scanning the papers in front of her. There were several names, lists of people, and locations she didn't recognize. Her eyes narrowed as she examined the documents more closely. This wasn't just a plan to undermine Antonio, it was a full-scale takeover. Marco and Gabriel had been working together for longer than she realized. The plan was much bigger than she had anticipated. As she moved to grab the papers, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Maria froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't be caught now. Quickly, she stuffed the papers into her jacket, her heart racing as she moved to hide behind a heavy bookshelf. The footsteps grew closer, and she held her breath, praying she wouldn't be noticed. The door opened slowly, and Maria could just make out Marco's figure as he entered the room. He was talking to someone, but Maria couldn't hear their conversation. She stayed as still as possible, not daring to move. Marco stepped further into the room, his back to her. This was her chance. She waited for the right moment, then silently slipped out of the room and into the hallway. The adrenaline was pumping through her veins now. She had the information. She had to get it to Antonio before it was too late. As Maria made her way toward Antonio's office, her mind raced. She had seen enough to know that Marco and Gabriel were ready to make their move. But now, she had the key to stop them. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but she had just taken the first step to turn the tide in Antonio's favor. She knew the stakes were high, and she wasn't about to let them lose everything. Not after everything they had fought for. The tension in the mansion was palpable as Maria made her way to Antonio's office. She had the papers, the evidence that could stop Marco and Gabriel's plan in its tracks, but now she needed to act fast. She couldn't afford to be caught in this game, not now. The hall seemed to stretch on endlessly, each footstep echoing in the quiet space. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her actions pressing on her like never before. This was no longer just about loyalty or trust. It was about survival. As she reached Antonio's office, she hesitated for a brief moment before knocking softly. The door opened, and Antonio looked up from the desk where he had been quietly reading through some documents. His expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to his gaze. He had been expecting her. "Maria," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "Come in. I trust you have what I need." Maria stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. This wasn't just any conversation, it was the tipping point. She held the papers tightly in her hands, the only thing standing between Antonio and the chaos that Marco and Gabriel were ready to unleash. She handed them over, watching closely as Antonio took them from her. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes scanning the pages with focused intensity. "What did you hear?" he asked after a moment, his gaze still fixed on the documents. "Everything," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Marco and Gabriel are planning to move against you. It's bigger than I thought. They have allies in high places, people who want to see you fall." Antonio's jaw tightened at her words, but he didn't show any outward signs of panic. Instead, he folded the papers and placed them neatly on his desk, his eyes never leaving Maria. "You did well," he said quietly. "This is what I needed to know." Maria's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the information she had provided. It was something else, something in the way Antonio was looking at her. She had become more than just a maid to him. She had become indispensable. Antonio stood up slowly, walking around the desk to stand in front of her. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the space between them had narrowed. "You've proven yourself, Maria," he said, his voice low. "I can trust you. But now, things are about to get dangerous. Marco and Gabriel won't stop, and if we don't act, it could be too late." Maria nodded, her mind racing with what she had just learned. Antonio was right. This was only the beginning. The pieces were in motion, and if she didn't help him stop it now, everything they had worked for could come crashing down. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice resolute. Antonio's eyes softened just a fraction, but there was no hesitation in his response. "I need you to stay close to Marco and Gabriel. Watch them, listen to their conversations, and report back to me immediately. We can't let them make a move without us knowing." Maria's stomach twisted with the weight of the task ahead. She had to get closer to them, find out everything they were planning. But she also knew that the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Antonio placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was both reassuring and heavy with expectation. I'm counting on you, Maria. You're not just helping me now. You're helping protect everything we've built. Maria nodded once more, the gravity of her role settling in. I won't let you down, she said, her voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes. As she left Antonio's office, the reality of the situation hit her like a wave. The mansion that had once seemed like a safe, almost comforting place now felt like a battlefield. Marco and Gabriel were plotting behind closed doors, and Maria was caught in the middle of it all. She had a task to do, but the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. If she failed, everything could fall apart. The next few days were filled with quiet observation. Maria kept her distance from Marco and Gabriel, watching them carefully, noting every shift in their behavior, every glance they exchanged. She knew they didn't trust her, and that was a good thing. If they suspected she was onto them, they might move too soon, and that would give Antonio the advantage. But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every day she spent in the mansion, watching them, felt like a countdown. The tension between her and the two men was palpable. She was playing a dangerous game, one that could cost her everything if she made a single wrong move. One night, as she was walking through the main hall, she overheard Marco speaking to someone on the phone. She couldn't hear the full conversation, but she caught enough to make her blood run cold. It's almost time, Marco said, his voice low and urgent. We move in the next 48 hours. We'll have everything we need. It's too late for Antonio to stop us. Maria's heart pounded in her chest. The plan was moving faster than she had anticipated. She had no time to waste. She had to get the information back to Antonio before it was too late. With the evidence she had, there was still hope, but only if she acted quickly. She couldn't let Marco or Gabriel outsmart her. She couldn't let them win. With a new sense of urgency, Maria made her way back to Antonio's office, her steps quick and sure. She had just overheard the confirmation she needed. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act now, it could all be over. Maria's heart pounded as she rushed through the hallways toward Antonio's office. She had overheard Marco's phone call, and everything she had feared was coming true. The plot was moving faster than anticipated. Within 48 hours, they would strike. She didn't have much time to act, and the pressure was almost suffocating. As she approached the door, she paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had the information Antonio needed, but now it was up to her to deliver it in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion. She took a deep breath, knocked softly on the door, and entered. Antonio was standing by the window, his silhouette sharp against the dim light of the evening. He turned as she entered, his gaze locking onto hers. Maria, he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. What's happened? She stepped into the room, her heart still racing. The weight of the moment was clear on both their faces. It's moving faster than we thought, she said quickly. Marco and Gabriel, they've set their plan. They're making their move within the next 2 days. Antonio's eyes narrowed, the tension in his posture becoming more evident. He didn't say anything for a long moment, letting the words sink in. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low. Absolutely, Maria replied, her voice steady. I overheard Marco. He's confident. He said it's too late for you to stop them. Antonio stood still for a moment, considering the gravity of the situation. The air in the room seemed thick with the weight of the decision he now had to make. Finally, he looked at her, his gaze hardening. We don't have much time, he said, the steely determination returning to his voice. We act now, or we risk everything. He turned away from her, walking over to his desk and grabbing a phone from the drawer. Luca, he said into the phone, his voice calm but firm. I need you to gather the men. We're making our move tonight. He paused, listening to Luca on the other end. Yes, tonight. Get everyone in position. He hung up the phone and turned back to Maria. We'll have to confront them directly. If they're planning to betray me, we can't wait any longer. Maria felt a chill run through her. The plan was moving from a quiet game of information to open confrontation. Antonio wasn't one to hesitate, but this kind of action had consequences. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear starting to stir in her chest. Antonio walked toward her, stopping just in front of her. His eyes searched hers, as if weighing the trust between them. I need you to keep your eyes on everything, he said quietly. Marco and Gabriel won't act alone. They'll have help. People who think they can take over, people who want what we have built. Your job is to be the eyes and ears. You'll be my inside source, but you have to be careful. There are no guarantees. Maria nodded, understanding the gravity of her role. She had already proven herself to Antonio, but now she was truly stepping into a dangerous world, one where loyalty was tested in the harshest way possible. I understand, she said, her voice steady. Antonio studied her for a moment before speaking again. This isn't just about the organization, Maria. It's about survival. Marco and Gabriel are dangerous, but they're not invincible. If we don't act now, we risk losing everything. We risk losing control. Maria felt a wave of determination wash over her. She was in this now, fully committed. She had learned enough to know the stakes. This wasn't just about protecting Antonio's empire. It was about her survival as well. I'll do whatever it takes, she said firmly. Antonio gave her a small nod, his face betraying a rare hint of vulnerability. I know you will, he said quietly. We're in this together, Maria. As she left his office, the gravity of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. She had seen the stakes firsthand, and now she had to act. Her loyalty had been tested, and now, more than ever, she knew that everything she did in the next 48 hours could change the outcome. Maria knew she was walking a razor-thin line. The power struggle between Antonio, Marco, and Gabriel wasn't just about business. It was personal. Marco and Gabriel were once trusted allies, but betrayal was in the air, and she was caught in the middle of it. Every move she made had to be calculated. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Maria spent the rest of the evening watching Marco and Gabriel closely. Every glance, every word, was now under her scrutiny. The two men were behaving differently now, more assertive, more confident in their movements. They were getting ready, and Maria knew that their time was running out. As the night stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking, and every second that passed brought them closer to the confrontation that was inevitable. Her role had changed, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. The game was far from over, but Maria had already chosen her side. Now, she had to make sure it was the right one. The night was heavy with anticipation. Maria had been on edge all evening, knowing that the next few hours could change everything. The clock was ticking, and the confrontation that Antonio had warned her about was drawing near. Marco and Gabriel were making their move, and now it was her turn to act. She had the information Antonio needed, but there was still one question lingering in the back of her mind. Would she be able to deliver it in time to stop them? Maria moved through the mansion, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floors. She had to stay out of sight, move with precision, and remain calm. The weight of the task she had ahead of her was not lost on her. She had worked her way up from the bottom, from being a silent servant in the background to becoming a key player in this dangerous game. She had earned Antonio's trust, but now, it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. As she reached the hallway near the staff quarters, she heard voices, low, urgent, filled with intent. She paused, pressing her back to the wall, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The voices were familiar, Marco and Gabriel. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Maria knew she couldn't afford to miss a word. She strained her ears, trying to catch what they were saying. Everything's in place. Gabriel's voice was cold, controlled. By tomorrow night, Antonio will be out. We'll have full control of the operation. Maria's heart skipped a beat. Tomorrow night. That was the deadline. This was the moment they had been planning for. She had to stop them before it was too late. What about the others? Marco's voice was more agitated now. Do you trust them? We can't afford any surprises. They're loyal, Gabriel replied. Everyone who matters is on our side. Antonio won't see it coming. Maria's mind raced as she processed the information. The plan was set. Marco and Gabriel had gathered their supporters, and they were ready to make their move. Antonio had warned her, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. She had to act fast. Quietly, Maria slipped away from the hallway and made her way to Antonio's office. She couldn't risk waiting any longer. When she arrived, she knocked softly on the door, her heart pounding. Antonio's voice called out from inside, calm and commanding. Come in. Maria stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Antonio was standing by his desk, his expression hard and focused. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed, as if assessing the urgency in her presence. What did you find out? He asked, his tone serious. Maria handed him the information she had overheard, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "They're moving tomorrow night," she said. "It's all in place. They've got their people ready, and they're confident you won't see it coming." Antonio took the papers from her and scanned them quickly. His jaw tightened as he read, his expression darkening with each line. "This confirms what I suspected," he muttered, more to himself than to Maria. "They've been planning this for months. I knew something was off." Maria stood silently, watching him as he processed the information. She had seen him face challenges before, but this was different. This was personal. Antonio looked up at her, his gaze intense. "I'm glad you brought this to me," he said, his voice low. "You've proven yourself, Maria. But this isn't over yet. Tomorrow night, we make our move." Maria nodded, her heart racing as she took in his words. This was it. This was the point of no return. Antonio had made it clear, if they didn't act now, Marco and Gabriel would take everything from them. "What do you need me to do?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Antonio walked toward her, stopping just in front of her. "I need you to stay close to them," he said, his voice low and serious. "Watch them even more carefully now. We need to know their every move. If we wait too long, it will be too late." Maria felt a wave of determination wash over her. She had already given so much, but now, the danger felt even more real. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Antonio's expression softened, but just for a moment. "You've been more than just helpful, Maria," he said quietly. "You've been essential. And when this is over, we'll both know where we stand." Maria didn't say anything, but her thoughts were racing. She knew what was at stake, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything. She had been brought into Antonio's world, and now she had to see it through to the end. "I'll be ready," she said, her voice resolute. Antonio nodded, turning back to his desk. "Good. You have until tomorrow night. After that, there's no turning back." As Maria left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking. The next few hours would determine the fate of everything she had worked for. She had played her part, but now, the final act was in motion. Maria knew that the power struggle between Antonio, Marco, and Gabriel was far from over. The confrontation was inevitable, and she had to be ready. Tomorrow night, everything would be decided, and Maria was determined to make sure it was Antonio who came out on top. The night was tense. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The moment she had been dreading and preparing for had arrived. Marco and Gabriel were making their move. She had done everything in her power to keep Antonio informed, to keep him one step ahead. But now, it was up to him to act. Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The stakes had never been higher, and as she moved through the mansion, she knew this was a point of no return. She had seen how ruthless Marco and Gabriel could be. They had played their cards well, and the trust that Antonio had placed in her now felt like a heavy burden. She had to stay focused. Every second counted. As Maria made her way down the hallway toward Antonio's office, she noticed the heightened tension among the staff. Whispers filled the air, and there was a sense of unease that she couldn't ignore. Everyone knew that something big was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. It was a game of power and survival, and Maria was deep in the middle of it. She had no choice now but to follow through. When she reached Antonio's office, the door was already ajar. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately finding him. Antonio stood by the window, staring out at the city below. His expression was unreadable, but Maria could see the sharp focus in his gaze. He had been preparing for this moment, and now it was time to put everything into motion. "Maria," Antonio said without turning around. "You're here." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sense of purpose that made her heart race. "What's the plan?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the tension building inside her. Antonio turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. "We move tonight. We confront Marco and Gabriel before they can make their move." Maria nodded, her pulse quickening. This was it. "I'll handle the details. You stay close to me. We need to make sure they know that we won't be intimidated," Antonio said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "We strike first. No hesitation." Maria felt a surge of determination. Antonio had always been the leader, always the one in control, but now, they were partners in this battle. She would do whatever it took to protect him and his empire. "I'm with you," she said firmly. Antonio walked toward the door, his expression hardening. "Let's go then." As they made their way through the mansion, the tension in the air was thick. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The closer they got to Marco and Gabriel's territory within the mansion, the more Maria could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. They were walking into enemy territory, and everything they had worked for was on the line. As they entered the main hall, Maria could see Marco and Gabriel at the far end, their backs to them, talking quietly. They didn't see Antonio and Maria approach. Antonio signaled for her to stay behind him, and as they closed the distance, he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "Marco, Gabriel." Antonio's voice was cold, laced with a sharp edge. Both men turned in surprise, their faces registering shock as they saw Antonio standing there, flanked by Maria. Gabriel recovered first, a sly smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "Antonio," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Did you really think you could stop us?" Marco said nothing, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Maria watched, her senses heightened, waiting for any sign of aggression. Antonio's eyes never wavered. "I know what you're planning," he said, his tone low but full of authority. "And I won't let you destroy everything I've built." Gabriel's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You've already lost, Antonio," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is just the beginning." Antonio stepped forward, his presence commanding, his gaze unflinching. "Not yet," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You've underestimated me." In that moment, the tension was unbearable. Maria could feel the energy shift, could feel the room hold its breath. Then, without warning, Antonio made his move. With a quick motion, he gestured for Luca, the head of security, to step forward. The guards, who had been silently watching from the shadows, moved in, surrounding Marco and Gabriel. The two men, realizing they were trapped, quickly backed away, but it was too late. The confrontation had begun. "You thought you could betray me and walk away unscathed?" Antonio's voice was low, almost a growl. "You're going to regret this." Gabriel, now visibly nervous, took a step back. "You can't do this," he said, his bravado slipping. "You're making a mistake." Antonio's eyes hardened. "The only mistake was trusting you," he said, his voice full of finality. As the guards closed in, Marco and Gabriel had no choice but to surrender. They had been caught, their plan unraveled. Antonio had won, but at a great cost. Maria stood silently beside him, her heart still racing, her mind trying to process everything that had just happened. The danger had passed, but the consequences were far from over. Antonio had won this round, but Maria knew that the game was never truly over. There would always be someone else waiting in the shadows, ready to challenge them. And Maria, for better or worse, was now a part of that world. She had proven her loyalty. She had stood by Antonio when it mattered most. But in this world, loyalty was constantly tested, and Maria knew that the future would bring more challenges. For now, though, they had won. Antonio's empire was secure, for now. In this captivating story, the intense journey of Maria unfolds as she navigates the dangerous world of power, loyalty, and betrayal. From being a silent servant in the shadows, Maria becomes an unexpected key player in a high-stakes game of survival, where trust is rare and danger lurks at every corner. As tensions rise, Maria's loyalty to Antonio is tested when she uncovers a plot to overthrow him, leading her to become an insider in the Mafia world. The story dives into the raw emotions of power struggles, loyalty, and survival, creating a deep connection to readers who enjoy romance stories filled with unexpected twists. With Maria caught in the middle of a conspiracy, every decision she makes could alter the future of the empire, making her a powerful and pivotal character in this thrilling tale. As the battle for control intensifies, Maria's growing bond with Antonio adds a layer of complex emotion to the narrative, blending the themes of romance stories with high tension. The unexpected turn of events pushes Maria to make difficult choices that will define her fate, her loyalty, and her future in the world of crime. As the stakes escalate, the romantic tension between Antonio and Maria becomes undeniable, making this one of the most intriguing romance stories you'll read. Will Maria's loyalty to Antonio be her salvation, Or will the darkness of the Mafia world pull her into its depths? Discover the power, intrigue, and emotional depth of this unforgettable story as it unfolds, blending elements of action and romance stories in a way that will leave readers on the edge of their seats.